Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. I mean, introductions take up so much time. So we're here to discuss the perfect crime, which might actually attract the wrong sort of attention in certain quarters. So I thought it actually might be more appropriate to modify that title a little bit and say that we are here to actually discuss the perfect crime novel. And we leave the subject of the perfect crime to the criminologists. So, yeah, to begin with, then, actually, this particular title perhaps came to mind for the organizers because Wasim Khan was to be part of the session. Unfortunately, he didn't get his visa, and he has edited an anthology of world crime fiction with Maxim Jakubowski titled The Perfect Crime. But that is as it may be. But, yeah, coming back to the question of the perfect crime novel, then, I'd like to ask the two panelists first, beginning perhaps with Simon. Which are the books for you as readers as well as writers of crime fiction that approximate to the perfect crime novel? How do you get the balance right between form and content while writing crime fiction? So maybe we could begin with Simon.
Thank you, Tarun. That's a double-barrel question. Let me just start by saying the perfect crime is a crime where the suspect is never caught. I think the perfect crime story, or the perfect crime mystery story, is where the whodunit is addressed with tension and excitement, mystery, and a big bang finish. However, I feel there should be more to the perfect crime story or crime mystery. In that, we should be looking at the why done it, examining the human condition. Why do people do crazy things? It's not, who killed the major in the library with the brass candelabra. It should be why. Why did he do it? Why did he choose the library? So in my writing, I like to look at the human condition. Why does an elderly man steal a can of beans in a supermarket when he has money in his pocket and he's not hungry? It's probably loneliness. And in Japan, where I live and have lived half my life, these crazy things happen. Elderly Japanese people will steal just so they can have someone to talk to, and that either talk to a policeman or to end up in prison with lots of new friends and 3 free meals a day. So let me not talk too much about that, but on to form and content. I think if you're talking about a good story well told, then both form and content are equally as important. Form being the style, the lyricism, the mood, the tone, everything that makes reading enjoyable. I think that's style, form, very important. On the other hand, content, the meaning, the greater meaning of the story, the revelations, the enlightenment, these things that we can learn through reading a crime mystery. So that's my 2 cents worth, Tarun.
Thank you for that. Nilanjana.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say, since the moderator refused to introduce himself, that we see Tarun a little bit as a patron saint of literature. He's encouraged so many writers across science fiction, fantasy. He has a great anthology of detective fiction, short stories out and available in the bookstore, if you'd like to take a look after this session. Simon, thanks for setting that up and making my job very easy out here. But the perfect crime is different from the perfect crime novel. And for me, I'm a little bit of a classicist. It's not so much, as Simon said, about who did this. It is about the why, the mysteries of human nature. Why would you just casually move another human being out of your way? Or why would you sit there planning for years and years sometimes to do something like that? And I have 3 books on my list that caught my attention early. One was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. often seen just as a literary classic, but all through it, the title character is missing, but she's such a strong presence. And what happened to her, there's actually a really sharp, the clockwork of that plot is beautiful. It raises the hair on the back of your neck in the chapters where you're looking at what happens. She comes back, kind of, from the dead. And who did whatever they did to her. The second one is not that literary, but it's a book I love with all my heart, Mystic River. Yeah, Dennis Nehane, where 3 boys, close friends, go out to play. One of them is picked up by a man driving by, or men driving by in a car. And many years later, those chickens come home to roost. And the third is a book that you don't think of as a crime novel, but it's written by a criminal. It's a confession, Lolita, Vladimir Nabokov. And it's a confession that ends tragically for the confessor after he's come to terms not just with, in his case, it's not murder, it's rape. And he's come to terms with the fact that whatever he did, whatever he was driven by, created a storm of devastation for both his victim and for himself. So when I look at that, I think that the perfect crime basically, like a stiletto, goes straight to the human heart. I can't even begin to try to emulate that. Black River is my first attempt at crime fiction, and it evolved into crime fiction. It didn't come from me sitting down saying that I want to jump into the genre. I had too much respect for the genre to disturb that swimming pool. But it came out of, as a younger journalist, witnessing perhaps at close quarters too many losses, too many murders, the killings, the disappearances of young girls. And journalism didn't really give me a place to put that anger, that grief, that burning rage that you feel at all these missing lives. And what Black River is about, this is something crime fiction I think allows you to do. Simon spoke of loneliness. And this book is not just about grief and how to carry it. It is about that, how to survive, one of the worst losses of them all. But I hope that something of the tenderness that precedes a grief also came through it. And this is what I love about crime fiction. It's so big. Yeah. It's so roomy, it's capacious, and it allows all of us in.
Yes, it can. It can in the right hands, and certainly I think that's in evidence when we think of Black River in particular. And thank you for bringing up the question of motivation, which is such a key facet to so much of even the rather lurid crime thrillers that many of us are so addicted to. But in the case of serious literary fiction, becomes a more complex psychological question as well. So let's now, since actually we've already turned in effect to the novels which you have recently written. Tell us a little bit, both of you, I'd like you to tell me about the genesis of your books, the kind of research perhaps that you've done beforehand. In the case of Simon, I believe he's an accidental crime writer. Perhaps in your case, Nilanjana, it came also as a result of your immersion in crime reporting. But yes, you've now turned to fiction, as you pointed out, perhaps not necessarily in a very deliberative way, but just sort of as a way of elaborating on certain prior concerns. So please share with us the process of thinking that led you in your respective cases to this genre. So Simon, you go first.
Okay, thank you, Tarun. Yeah, that's always a really tough question to get so much into so little, but I'll do my best. I could pretty much sum it up with three points, the process of how this story came to be. The first is the motivation to tell a positive story, a story about an underdog who succeeds. So I'm a big fan of triumph over adversity. I feel there's so much bad news out there. There's so much grief and loss. There are people writing plenty of stories about that, but I feel there's not enough that punches us through the other side to see the little person succeed, to overcome obstacles. So I wanted to write a story first and foremost about a woman who does that as a private detective. And The book is set in Kobe in Western Japan. It's an area I've lived for more than half my life. So the inspiration for the story came one day when I was sitting at home and a leaflet fell into my mailbox. A leaflet advertising the services of a female private detective. Middle-aged woman wearing a nice suit and with a specialty in cheating husbands. So I filed it away, thinking it's not every day this pops into your mailbox, and that was the seed that germinated. And it all began as a short story, and the readers loved the short story so much that they urged me on, and they said, "This woman has legs. This private detective could be a novel." So that set me up for stage number 3, the motivation, the inspiration, and then finally the research. So how to research this? First of all, I've lived in Japan for 27 years, so I don't know anything else to write about. Secondly, I have a background in travel journalism. And Mami Suzuki Private Eye is really less of a mystery and more of a travel book, driven by 4 separate mysteries. And Mami Suzuki is the one who is the person whose footsteps we follow in. So as she travels, the reader goes along. I've spent a lot of time traveling in Japan and know all the places that she has been to, so I can write from first-hand experience. And finally, I had to take a trip to Tokyo. I took 2 trips to Tokyo to talk with private investigators. They were both men. And, of course, one of the key questions was, how about female private investigators? Tell me about them. And there aren't many. There's a dearth of female investigators in Japan. So they also said that women have a greater power of intuition, and they're able to read things better than men, read people better. And they're also better at stealth. And when it comes to cheating husbands, a man being followed by a man in a dark alley is very suspicious. But a woman following a man, the guy he's not going to be suspicious. He's probably going to be happy. So all this research left to ferment. The essence rose to the top. I scooped it off and came up with 4 separate stories which take the reader on a journey around Japan.
Thank you for that. Yeah, indeed. And memorable character indeed, Mami Suzuki, as we will discover further as the discussion unfolds. So Nilanjana, what prompted you to turn from your prior interest in writing fantasy to noir fiction? And yes, the further questions were already
I loved Simon's kombucha method of writing. You let it ferment and you scoop the foam off. That was great. But I don't think I intended. Everything I've done has been pretty much intuitive, just following my instincts much more than intentional. But I like walking. I like walking around cities. Even a city as tough as Delhi, it's got its softer side. And I like getting into conversations with people whom I wouldn't otherwise get to meet. And I think I had 3 encounters on those walks that really made me want to write this book. One was with a woman who wasn't, the opposite of the sweet stereotype of a woman. She was bad and she liked being bad. She wasn't, as terrible as one of the women who gets murdered in Black River. But she had she had a wonderfully amoral nature, and she had several professions. She ran a matka gambling den. She also ran a fashion and beauty parlor for younger women who were aspiring to get into the bar dancing trade in rural Uttar Pradesh, And she ran a few other things that were so murky, I probably don't want to talk about them. And her thing was simple. When I asked her about this musing journalist, sweet South Delhi girl question about morality, she said, that's all for you. The world, you don't know anything about it. It's out to get you, and I'm out to get mine. And I was like, okay, fine. I can write about women who go off to the dark side, who often betray kids or do terrible things. The second person I met wasn't actually a meeting. I just saw this young boy fresh off the train, stopping at New Delhi railway station. And he stopped for a while on ITO Bridge. Okay? And at some point I realized I wasn't actually seeing him. He wasn't there. There was this blur of migrants fresh who'd gone by, but he was as clear as though he existed. And it was the ITO Bridge is one of my nightmares. I can't deal with that kind of crowd and pollution and people jostling by. But he was standing in the middle of all of it, and he was just looking down with such wonder. And I just knew that he had come to Delhi in search of adventure, and what he had found in the city was something I couldn't see at that point. And the third person I met was a policeman under under circumstances that are probably best not spoken about on stage. But this was again in the suburbs of Haryana, and I was trying to get out of a slightly tricky situation, and he came by in his Jeep and offered me a lift very kindly. And we got to talking, and he went on this rant about how the media reports police people. And among the things he said is, we are not all terrible, the system is terrible, it crushes us, but have you seen the way that we have to live? And then he stopped in the middle of this rant, and he said rather plaintively, my feet hurt. And I was like, okay, I need to have more conversations with constables and inspectors, which I did. But the book came to me strangely, I think when you open yourself up to a certain way of seeing, then fiction comes to you. It literally comes to you in a certain kind of vision. And there was so much that I found I wanted to write about. I was very nervous about being a novelist. Fantasy was safe for me, and it remains one of my first loves. And I think I was terrified when I realized that I was changing gears into a genre that I respect so much, and that seems very difficult to me. I worked as hard as I could with plot, but at some point I realized this is what I want to tell about the old stuff, the good stuff, good and evil, and in the middle of it, a little bit of fun sometimes in the middle of all the sadness and darkness. And crime lets you do that, and it started to embrace the city as well. It started to become a story of a city in change. It's capacious.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. It's a sort of novel which, in its juxtapositions, the city, the hinterland, absolutely brings to the fore some of the hidden facets so beautifully. Can you then, each of you, please share with us, maybe do a bit of a reading, some chosen passages, maybe briefly, because as you can see, the time is short, but we'd love to get a flavor, as it were, of these respective narratives. So begin with Simon, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, I'd just like to say that Japan is a season of 4 countries, 4 seasons. Japan is a country of 4 seasons, and the seasons dictate the events, the food, the moods of the people. So for each of the 4 stories that are interlinked in this book, each starts with a season, a cue, a context for what will follow. So these are very short. I'm going to read 3 paragraphs, one from each of the stories. The second story is called Land of the Gods. Autumn was Suzuki's favorite season. It was when the ginkgo trees shed their gold across the city sidewalks. Persimmons were sold for a song in the wholesale markets, and the burnished copper hues of the hillsides made the Rocco Mountains a sight to behold. It was also the one time of the year when the briny breath of the harbour bowed to the sweet fragrance of the orange olive blossom drifting from the small parks and gardens behind the quays. This is Kobe City. So let me move on to the third. So the third story is called Sounds of the Tide, and again, it's a different season. Spring arrived with all the usual excitement of new beginnings across the archipelago. Companies hired new recruits, children entered schools, and universities commenced the new academic year. To help things along, TV weather presenters donned pink jackets, Towns slung plastic cherry blossoms from their eaves, and beverage makers masked their bottles and cans in sakura motifs. And finally, from the fourth story called Isle of Cats, this is the first paragraph. Summer had arrived and the city simmered. Having drifted up from the Philippines and delivered their rain throughout June and July, the warm air currents of the Kuroshio, the Black Stream, now ground to a standstill over Kobe. Nights were the worst, when the pent-up heat of the day oozed from the concrete, and the undulating hum of air conditioners played background to the dreams of the lucky few who slept. Those who couldn't went to bed grumpy and awoke grumpier. Only Suzuki's mother's hydrangeas of pastel pink and blue nodded happily in the humid sea breeze.
Yeah, thank you for that. Nicely captures the textures of life in a particular part of Japan, especially that last image. And I assure you that this Isle of Cats is probably worth a visit someday. It does exist, right? Yes. So for those who are cat lovers, your fantasies may come true if you visit Japan. There is an Isle of Cats. But let's now turn to Nilanjana's reading, please. Yes.
I love that reading. I didn't want it to stop. You know, you really took us somewhere beautiful. So there's someone I want you to meet. Her name is Munya. She's 8. And she's alone at home in the village of Titarpur. Munya's silent prayers work. Her aunt leaves to collect wood for the stove, and in a flash she's out, exploring. The sun leaves thorny prickles on her skinny, bare legs as she steps into the cool grey mud where her father had watered the plants that morning. She likes the way it squishes up between her toes, a friendly massage from the earth. A strip of sun-baked earth, powdery and ferociously hot beneath the soles of her feet, spans the gap between the canal and the neem and jamun trees. The thin silver chains of her anklets set off a faint carillon as she fits one foot and then the next into the white cracks in the scorching earth. She shudders at the delicious change in temperature, the coolness secreted far away, deep inside the furrowed land. And placing her cheek against the bark of trees, she feels the difference between smooth bark and scaly bark, the texture of each tree as singular and well known to her as her own family's faces. Her uncle's rich dark skin, her aunt's papery, delicate skin, the comforting touch of her father's rough-skinned, gentle fingers. She walks warily over the fallen neem bolees, careful not to tread on the green berries. They are hard as stones. It is quiet in the orchard, with no spring breeze to cool the air, only the first heavy stirrings of the summer heat rising up from the dust. A worker's scaffold, the shape of a swing, lies at the foot of the tree, anointed by a thick coil of rope, a leftover from the construction on the lovely pure-veg Bhojanalaya. She's seen her father use it to repair the roof thatch. She ducks beneath the jamuns. Their slender, long-fingered branches reach out and brush her tangled hair. Munya has plucked a skirt full of berries when she sees the man. He is in the nearby plot, leaning back against the low fence. Strangers rarely come through this part. There is nothing to tempt them in this untended plot of common land that separates the fields from the forest soaring above. But the man is no stranger.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very powerful. We could now perhaps just take up very briefly some of the questions which came to my mind as discussion points and which I have shared with the panel beforehand, just to be upfront. So let me begin with the parallels between detection and ethnography. This is directed to Simon. As detection, the parallels between detection and ethnography as modes of inquiry into the human condition. So can we see the clues as being the sort of common link, as it were, between these two rather distinct modes of inquiry? And in fiction in particular, Do you see yourself as undertaking a kind of ethnographic quest of sorts, with Mami Suzuki in particular, in effect becoming the fulcrum for this quest? You're sifting through the layers and, in effect, creating a language of description in fictional form for contemporary Japan, I suppose. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer, but I'll do my best. As a foreigner, originally from New Zealand via Australia, a foreigner who has lived in Japan for half his life, it's a very familiar place to me. And it has informed my writing hugely. Everything I know about Japan has gone into the story. But if we look at modern Japan, and there is an amazing and wonderful contrast between traditional and modern Japan. They somehow both just flow together. But like every country around the world, it has its social maladies. It has problems. It has alcoholism, poverty. There's power harassment. We also have some very strange phenomena, such as hikikomori, which is a social withdrawal syndrome. We have karoshi, which is death by overwork. And the one that I have dealt with in this book as one of the mysteries, one of the reasons why there is a mystery, is johatsu. Johatsu means literally evaporation. It's when people just drop out of society. They can't handle life anymore. They can't handle the pressures of work and family, and they just vanish. And there are even companies that specialize in helping people move overnight. Here one day, gone the next. So these are problems which the police have little time for. They fall between the gaps. And it's up to private detectives, such as Mami Suzuki, to help people solve their problems. And in a way, it kind of follows the typical noir setup, where you have an amateur detective working beyond the police. So yes, Mami Suzuki does take into account a lot of Japan's social problems that exist today, and without them, I hate to say, Mami Suzuki wouldn't have a job. So that's my comment on that issue. I didn't deal with ethnography, but I think once you live in a country long enough, you start to live and breathe and understand the culture from the inside, and that big word, ethnography, explains that perfectly.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, you become an insider/outsider, which may not necessarily entail your having to, say, interview research subjects and garner information and details, which then later become part of an elaborate write-up. Instead, you're using your imagination, and that allows for a different kind of transmuting of what you're gleaning, sometimes at the subconscious level, and that's ultimately it culminates in the work of fiction, in this case very elegantly crafted detective fiction. So tradition and modernity has come up as a kind of broader question, and the transitions that have taken place. Of course, in detective fiction and crime fiction, suspense is a key aspect, a key element of the narration. And in Black River, we have a bit of that. It's a police procedural, yes, set in 2017-18. And I would suggest, in fact, in my view, it's a brilliant instance of how crime fiction can become a vehicle for critique. And critique, I would suggest, of the dominant model of development prevalent in our country at this time. The impact of this dominant model on the ecosystem of the Yamuna in particular, which of course provides the title for the story, the relationship between the city, as we've already discussed, and the hinterland, Delhi and Titarpur, and also the patterns of migration and intercommunity ties, including the situation in particular of minority communities. Very beautifully captured the vulnerability, I would say, of some of these minority communities. So could we think of your work as a work of fictive testimony? I threw out this term yesterday during the discussion, but yes, do you see yourself as writing fiction which could be seen as a mode of witnessing and unfolding, of course, in fictional form? Yeah. So, but broadly, yeah. Yeah.
I don't think I wrote with that noble sense of purpose, but a lot of what you've said, I think, comes by instinctively when you're looking at your city changing. And I wanted it to be not fun, maybe, with the grimness, but I wanted Black River to be entertaining. I wanted people to feel what the city was like. When you arrive here as an outsider, and what you've got with you is a handful of dreams, and you can make a friendship, which Chand does with Khalid and his wife Rabia, that might be absolutely impossible, or not even impossible, not even prohibited, inconceivable, back where you come from, because the segregation runs so deep. It's not that the city doesn't have its segregation, and Umbir, the policeman out here, is particularly suspicious of this. He's got a thing about the city has as hard a heart as the village. They're just more sophisticated and they know how to hide it better. But I think I was writing with some urgency because the memories that we have were being changed by the blare of this mass media and by one story being told about the country, about the capital, about Delhi itself, right? And that's where I think fiction becomes a little bit of a sneak thief, Fiction is the one that just gets in quietly off to a side and says, let me sneak this past your guard and let me give you a slightly different sense of the history of the city. What does it look like from the underside? Not when you have the grand billboards announcing one great project after another, not when you have, just great leadership being repeated over and over again as your predominant image. But what about the people who build the flyovers? What about the people whose lives are brought together on the banks of the Yamuna? And Khalid, Chand and Rabia live at a time when it's dangerous, but it's also so beautiful. Most of us who live in Delhi live away from the river. We don't think about it. When I came to Jaipur first many years ago, I was just astonished at the natural landscape, the fact that you have forests and beautiful parks out here. And unconsciously, you kind of live and breathe all of that. When we say that the air of Delhi is polluted, we are choking. We're making a half political statement as well. But before, we feel that happen, what happens is also the violent separation of friendships that have formed nevertheless. You see what I mean? Absolutely. And I just felt that a novel was the perfect container for this, because what happens with a novel and with crime fiction is that you can let things mingle. Your novel doesn't just have to be a study of this, or just have to be a police procedural, or just have to be a story about three people trying to make their way through a very difficult time and through extremely difficult griefs and losses, and who find their solace in a friendship that isn't supposed to happen. You see? So you can bring it all together.
Very nicely put. Well, absolutely. Yes. New forms of solidarity, perhaps even new forms of imagined community, to invoke Benedict Anderson's much perhaps invoked term, but in a new context. So thank you for that. I think we have time for Q&A, just about the right time for that. So please raise your hands and I'll ask them to... Oh, okay. So then we can keep the conversation going. So 10 minutes for Q&A is good enough, I think. It deserves, I think, a bit of discussion. So please, can you hand over the mic to the lady in the first row?
Yeah. Hello, everyone.
Yes, please go ahead.
My question is to the panel. You've briefly told us about your books. I just wanted to know, what was the editing process for you like? Was it after you had written, or was it during, and how was your experience getting pieces edited, and any parts that you really liked but the editors had something else to say? So what did each of you feel about it? Thank you.
Editors can be cruel. So yeah, Simon?
Yeah, I love that question because I've got a big bone to pick with the Penguin people.
Careful there, careful. Your next book may depend on what you say next.
So, as every writer does, they create something that's very precious and special to them, and they read over and over and over before they submit it. So they're submitting their best, the best of the best they can do. Now, when it goes to the copy editor, you have good copy editors and not so good copy editors. And there have been instances where I received my manuscript back, and there were words that had been changed, and it had changed the meaning of what I had wanted to say. So I was quite offended, but at the same time, I think it's all about you're working as a team to get this book published. So it's about talking with the people who are doing the editing, trying to get them to see it your way. It's give and take. So yes, the process of people handling your goods is one you have to go at with an open mind.
Okay, we had very, very different experiences, so I love that answer. My editors, my agent, David Godwin, and my editor, Kartika and Ajita, were my safety nets. And they needed to be. The thing with me is that I have fluency with words, and I will say this. I never know whether I'm a decent writer or not, but I am the queen of messy first drafts, So what I did was, with my first draft, I tried to write in serious voice, and that doesn't work for me beyond a point. So I looked at it and waited for my agent to get back to me. He was gentle about it, but basically there was a character who wasn't working at all because I wasn't interested in her. She was just a vehicle for all the editorials I wanted to write that were great editorials, but had no place whatsoever in novels or fiction. And so I threw out 180 pages. And it was about 1.5 years, 2 years worth of work, and it was terrible. It had choked off the voice of the book, and it was only when I threw it out, which was not an easy decision to make, but which was a liberating decision to make. That's when the book started to come into view. And I think what I did love about the editing process, again, by the time I handed over the final draft, I was much less vulnerable, much more sure. And you hover like a hawk over that final draft because you really have not just worked at, the technical side of it, the plotting, the timing, that means a lot to me. The seasons, something simple like if Ombir and Bhimsen are going out for a walk and it's a full moon night, it cannot be a dark night 3 nights later. You just can't do that. But more than that, I think I had worked at the guts of the story. It had a beating heart. And to my amazement, Kartika and Ajita took a look at the manuscript and took a look at the 2 points that I'd finessed because I was feeling very tired and I just wanted the book out. And I was like, okay, fine, I can skate by on this and I don't have to finish this chapter neatly. And they were like, there's a little rough patch out there. And I was like, oh God, caught. But everything they did, in my case, just made the book that much better. It wouldn't really have been that readable or that unmessy without them.
So it can play a crucial role absolutely in finessing the final version of the text. Thank you. Yes, lady in the yellow? Yeah, thank you.
I think it's really fascinating that you talked about the human condition behind why people kill. I think I'm curious about the flip side of why do you think we choose to consume content like that? I'm thinking about shows like, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Hannibal. It's a show that really aestheticizes murder and violence, or writing that really brutally describes and viscerally describes the act of killing or corpses. Things that are so disgusting and ugly and brutal, yet and I hope it's a we and not an I, but we're still able to find some weird sense of beauty or aesthetic within that. So what do you think that says about the human condition? Why do we find these really weird things beautiful, or able to find aesthetics within them?
Anyone would like to take that?
I think we're a lot like cats. They look so sleek and they're purring and they're sweet and they're killers at heart and they have a very grim side to them, right? personally speaking, I would never stop another writer from doing it, but there was a huge vogue for that kind of, shocking, horrifying exhumation of a corpse, and often a female corpse, particularly, or a female victim. There was a lot of lingering on the cruelty of murder. And after a while, that does, I don't want to be, again, censorious about this, but I think it just turns it into a splash of blood across the pages, and you start to lose the humanity of the victim. So in my case, I wasn't going to do it that way. Oh, we are almost through, so I'm just going to say one thing. I'd seen enough in the way of the bodies of the dead and the families, the survivors, those left behind, and I wasn't going to do that to my victims. There's a way to write about it that makes you grieve, but it doesn't have to be violative of their privacy, even if they are fictional.
If I may just add a quick word, Alok Rai famously coined a phrase with reference to partition literature and some of the even very good partition writing by the progressive writers, no less. And that phrase was the pornography of violence. And I think that has a bearing on what we're speaking of. If it's just a spectacle, it can become equivalent to exactly that. Not even just the aestheticizing aspect, but it's titillation. It's catering sometimes to certain kinds of visceral urges. It becomes debasement almost in the long run. Of course, one might argue that Scandinoir has actually a purpose and a function in a slightly different context of shaking up an otherwise blasé society, which is believed to be very happy on the whole, the welfare state and all the rest of that, and there was a kind of shock value. But I think it, as you say, began to become overused. These tropes, they become cliches in turn, and in that case, then they slide into a trough of overuse and repetition. So your point is well taken. Yeah, at the back.
A very good afternoon to the panel. My question to the panel is, do you have any elements of your personal life that you added in your characters that you relate too much, or you have your own opinion added to it in your book? Please answer.
The subjective dimension. Do you, in detective fiction, that's rare to see, I would say, but...
Just to clarify, your question is asking how much of ourselves we put into our characters?
Exactly.
Hmm.
Remember, he's created a character who's a woman. So there's an interesting dimension there. So if I may just add to that question to make it more interesting, how far were you able to get under the skin of Mami Suzuki, a Japanese woman?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot. How can a middle-aged white guy write from the perspective of a middle-aged Japanese woman? In my case, I put this question to my daughter, who's 16 years old, and I said, people are going to give me a hard time. They're going to say I can't do this, and she said, but why not? You've lived in Japan for half your life, and you're married to a middle-aged Japanese woman. So I said, yeah, that's right. Sometimes the kids have all the easy answers. The best answers are simple. So among my friends and acquaintances are a lot of middle-aged women. Quite a number of them are single mothers. And I teach at a women's university, and when I teach writing, they tell me things in their stories that they wouldn't normally say in class. So I'm getting these quite deep and personal insights. And all of these things have helped to develop the way my main character thinks.
And I'll make it short because I think we're close to out of time. Most of my characters are nothing like me. Chand's a farmer on the outskirts of Delhi. Rabia faces challenges that I can't even dream of. The area of the city that she lives in, Bright Delhi, is being communally torn apart, and she's being told that she no longer belongs to a place that she thought she belonged to just because of her religious identity. And Umbir and I come from different planets, my policeman. Right. But every one of my characters taught me. They showed me what the world looks like to somebody who feels Delhi, who feels the city, who feels the experience of belonging or not belonging very, very differently from the way I do. And for that, I'm grateful to fiction itself. Thanks.
If you could just extend that, say, for a second, we have a minute or so, with respect to this imagining masculinity, imagining Ombir as the figure. Did you consider having a woman detective as your protagonist?
I thought about it, but it comes down to patriarchy, which is that Umbir just had the agency to move up and down much more freely. And for this book, I needed somebody who could do that. Also, at the time that I'd finished, I hadn't spoken to enough people, enough women, not just in the police force, but in the detective world. After that, I think I did get a better sense of it. I didn't see it as a challenge creating a man be human. He thinks slightly differently. He occupies the world and he has space in a different way than I do. But that's true for all of your characters. It was when I found out how he thought. The challenge for me was to get into the head of this policeman who didn't actually think like a policeman some of the time and who grappled with his inconvenient sense of justice. And when I understood that for him, justice was a burden, it was something that he just thought of as this thing that kept popping up in his head. You must do right, but why? It got in the way of everything, and yet he could not help himself.
At the end of the day, justice must be pursued. Thank you. That's a fitting note, I think, on which to conclude our session. I guess we're out of time. Thanks very much. And